Okay, let's dive in. 50 years. I mean, half a century since the end of the Vietnam War. It's hard to wrap your head around sometimes.
It really is. And then, just 30 years since the U.S. and Vietnam normalized relations. Former enemies.
Exactly. And now you hear terms like a wonderful partnership, which former Ambassador Kritenbrink used. It just makes you pause and ask, how on earth did that happen?
Right. How do you go from that level of conflict to, well, to partnership? That's the journey we're exploring today.
And it wasn't passive, was it? It seems like very deliberate steps were taken.
Absolutely deliberate. We're looking at insights from Ambassador Kritenbrink's discussion, focusing on that reconciliation, the history, the strategic choices.
So for you listening, if you want to get up to speed on this complex relationship quickly, this is sort of your shortcut. We're unpacking that historical shift and what it means now.
Yeah, think of it as understanding how nations can choose engagement even after, well, devastating conflict. Ambassador Kritenbrink really stressed those anniversaries, 50 years since the war's end, 30 years of normalized ties.
They're powerful milestones. They really framed the transformation.
They do. It underscores just how far things have come, from intense animosity to, well, a situation where apparently the U.S. is viewed pretty favorably by many Vietnamese people.
Which is remarkable. So what were the key ingredients? How did they start building that bridge?
According to Kritenbrink, a huge part, maybe the foundation, was tackling the war legacies head-on.
You mean things like MIAs?
Yes, the search for missing personnel, which is incredibly sensitive, but also Agent Orange, the health and environmental impact.
Still affecting people today.
Absolutely. And clearing unexploded ordnance, UXO. These are deep, painful, tangible wounds. Addressing them required real cooperation.
You can see how working on those concrete issues, those human costs, could slowly build trust. Kritenbrink also mentioned handling sensitive history respectfully. That sounds tricky.
Oh, incredibly tricky. Take April 30th in Vietnam. That's the reunification day, marking victory.
Right, the fall of Saigon.
Exactly. Kritenbrink noted no U.S. ambassador has ever attended those official commemorations. It marks the end of the U.S.-backed government, so it's sensitive.
So the U.S. focus is elsewhere.
Yeah, the focus tends to be on July 11th, the anniversary of normalization. It's a careful diplomatic dance, acknowledging the past without reopening certain wounds in, perhaps, counterproductive ways.
But then, didn't Kritenbrink do something quite symbolic? A visit to a major Vietnamese military cemetery?
He did. The Trung Son National Cemetery, a hugely significant place for Vietnam, honoring their war dead.
That feels like a big step. How was that framed?
He was very clear about it, apparently. He called it a message of reconciliation, of respect for sacrifice on both sides. Crucially, he emphasized it was not an apology for the war itself.
A subtle but important distinction, acknowledging shared loss.
Precisely. And then you have these meetings between veterans from both countries.
That must be incredibly powerful. Former enemies face-to-face decades later.
Kritenbrink described them as inspiring, finding common humanity, with surprisingly little lingering animosity. It speaks volumes about moving forward.
And Kritenbrink himself had history with this, didn't he? Before he was ambassador, with Agent Orange talks.
Yes, under President George W. Bush. He co-chaired the U.S.-Vietnam dialogue on Agent Orange. That was critical groundwork.
A tough issue to tackle.
Definitely. It provided a vital channel to deal with one of the most painful, lasting consequences. It wasn't just talk. It led to real action and helped, ease some of those deep-seated tensions. Hugely important for the relationship long-term.
Okay, so that's the U.S. perspective on how this evolved. But what about Vietnam? Why were they willing to engage, to move towards partnership?
Well, Ambassador Kritenbrink shared insights from his many years talking with Vietnamese contacts, academics, strategists, friends. A big factor seems to be Vietnam's own strategic thinking.
Thinking about their neighborhood.
Exactly. They've got a long, long history of fighting for independence, including dealing with China, their massive neighbor to the north, holding on to deep resentment towards the U.S., especially with regional instability. It just wasn't seen as pragmatic long-term.
Makes sense. You can't let the past dictate all your future options, especially in a complex region.
And they genuinely appreciated the U.S. cooperation on those war legacy issues we talked about. Kritenbrink made a point of mentioning people like Senator Patrick Leahy.
He's been involved for decades.
For a very long time. His commitment built a lot of goodwill and respect in Vietnam. It showed consistency.
And this wasn't just talk. The support was tangible.
Oh, absolutely. Significant U.S. funding and technical help for cleaning up Agent Orange hotspots. Da Nang and Bien Hoa airports are the big ones.
Huge projects.
Massive. plus ongoing programs helping disable Vietnamese, especially in the provinces that were most heavily sprayed. That kind of concrete action, it demonstrates a real commitment to addressing the past. It builds trust.
Okay, so that covers the incredible journey of reconciliation. But relationships evolve, right? Let's talk about today some of the current complexities. Trade seems like a big one. Kritenbrink mentioned tariffs during the Trump administration.
Yes, trade became, central to the relationship after being almost non-existent, but it also became a point of friction. Kritenbrink mentioned tariffs hitting as high as 46% on some Vietnamese goods.
Wow, 46%. That's serious.
It is. And it happened while Vietnam's trade surplus with the U.S. was growing quite a bit.
How did Vietnam react to that kind of pressure?
Kritenbrink described their response as calm, practical, and constructive. Very strategic, very flexible. They didn't seem to panic.
They played the long game,
Seems like it. They engaged diplomatically, tried to find common ground even though it was a challenge.
recognizing the bigger picture, maybe.
I think so. Vietnam knew it was becoming a more important trade partner, so they looked for ways to address U.S. concerns proactively.
Like what? Buying more U.S. stuff?
Exactly. Considering big purchases, aircraft, LNG, farm products, also working on improving market access for U.S. companies in Vietnam, and even encouraging Vietnamese investment back into the U.S., trying to rebalance things.
So showing they were serious about tackling the imbalance.
Right. But that trade deficit, it's still there, still a point of discussion. And another layer is the U.S. expectation that Vietnam cracks down on Chinese goods being shipped through Vietnam to dodge U.S. tariffs on China.
Ah, the transshipment issue. That puts Vietnam in a tough spot.
A very delicate spot. They have to manage their vital U.S. economic ties, but also their relationship with China, which is their biggest overall trading partner.
All while trying to maintain their independence, which seems core to their history.
That's the key, isn't it? Vietnam's foreign policy has always been about navigating between big powers, maintaining autonomy. It's deeply ingrained.
And the U.S. is their biggest export market, even if China is the biggest overall trade partner.
Correct. The U.S. buys more Vietnamese exports than any other single country. So that relationship is absolutely crucial for Vietnam's economy.
And they formalized that importance recently.
They did. In 2023, they upgraded the relationship with the U.S. to a comprehensive strategic partnership,
Putting the U.S. on the same level as...
as their existing partnerships with China and Russia. It signals a commitment to a balanced, multi-directional foreign policy. Hedging their bets, perhaps.
So Kritenbrink's view is that the U.S. shouldn't try to pull Vietnam away from China, but rather support Vietnam's ability to stand on its own.
That's his take, yes. Focus on helping Vietnam be strong, independent, and capable of managing its own complex relationships, rather than forcing an us or them choice.
Which makes sense given Vietnam's history and geography. What about President Xi Jinping's visit to Hanoi not long ago? How does that fit?
It fits perfectly into Vietnam's strategy of engaging with everyone. Keeping lines open with Beijing is essential. For China, of course, it's about shoring up influence, especially as U.S.-Vietnam ties deepen.
A reminder that China is right there.
Definitely. And there were reports, as Kritenbrink alluded to, that Xi perhaps delivered a warning.
A warning? About what?
Essentially cautioning Vietnam not to align too closely with the U.S. in ways that might harm China's interests. It just highlights that tightrope Vietnam walks every day.
Okay, looking forward. If, hypothetically, there were a second Trump administration, what does Kritenbrink think Vietnam might expect?
Based on the first term, he suggests the focus would likely remain very strongly on trade, pushing for more U.S. exports to Vietnam, removing trade barriers for American companies. That imbalance would likely stay front and center.
But maybe a different style of dealing with it.
That's what he observed last time. A more, let's say, decisive, perhaps less consultative approach. Policies, like tariffs, could be implemented quickly, maybe with less back and forth beforehand.
Which caused some unease in Vietnam initially.
Understandably, yeah. Less predictability, maybe less chance to shape things through dialogue before decisions were made.
Yet, despite that possibility, Vietnam sounds like it remains committed to talking, to engaging.
That seems to be the consistent theme. Kritenbrink mentioned a planned Vietnamese trade delegation heading to Washington. It shows they intend to keep the dialogue going, keep working through issues pragmatically, regardless of who is in the White House.
So, summing up, it's this incredible story. From war to partnership, driven by addressing the past, strategic needs, careful diplomacy.
And now navigating these really complex modern challenges,
Yeah.
trade, geopolitics, balancing giants.
It really drives home how history isn't just history, right? It actively shapes today and tomorrow.
Absolutely. And the key seems to be that willingness on both sides over time to tackle the painful stuff, combined with looking ahead strategically and just keeping the lines of communication open.
It shows that even the deepest divides aren't necessarily permanent.
Exactly. Which is a powerful lesson in itself. Understanding how this particular relationship evolved gives you, the listener, real context for the complexities they face now.
Okay, so here's a final thought to leave you with. We've seen how former bitter enemies can build a strong partnership. What does the U.S. Vietnam story teach us about tackling other huge global challenges, things that seem completely intractable?
Yeah, think about that mix dealing with historical trauma, powerful economic forces, shifting alliances. How do those elements play out elsewhere? It's something worth mulling over. Perhaps it inspires you to look deeper into this history, or maybe even compare it to other post-conflict situations around the world.